Without doubt, the most influential book in the field of Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders in recent years has been The Five by Hayley Rubenhold, first published in 2019. This book is the first full-length examination of the lives of the five so-called canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. It has been controversial, not least because the author seems to have gone out of her way to engage in a very public spat with the world of ripperology, accusing it of being misogynistic and only interested in glamorising the character of Jack the Ripper, relegating the victims to the role of bit part players. The central thesis of her book is that most of the victims were not prostitutes and were not murdered while conducting that business. Hayley Rubenhold claimed that the women were murdered while sleeping rough, and they were unfairly and inaccurately labelled as prostitutes by misogynistic Victorian society. I will examine this claim, which can only have a massive impact on how these crimes are committed and potentially alter our understanding of how serial killers operate, which is of some importance for us to be able to inhibit the ability of these murderers to kill women and apprehend them as quickly as possible when they do. And women are overwhelmingly the most frequent victims of these killers. Given Hayley Rubenhold's disdain for the actions and attitudes of the police in late Victorian Britain, it's slightly ironic that the fundamental basis of her book, The Five, is based on an almost arbitrary victim count of Jack the Ripper proposed in 1894 by Melville Macnaghten, a senior Scotland Yard policeman. Her book scarcely glances at the other female victims found in the Whitechapel murder files that many policemen at the time and many researchers since have felt should be attributed to the same killer. The other irony is that her book, irrespective of her expressed distaste for ripperology, has become very influential in that field, even when many of the details she discusses have been hotly disputed. Many talking heads in ripperology have become hypersensitive, jumpy and nervous when discussing anything to do with what I jokingly refer to as suspectology. They overcompensate by appeasing the brand of feminism espoused by Hayley Rubenhold in their discourse. Feminism looks at this subject in two very distinct and opposing ways. On the one hand, sex-positive feminists embrace the victim's status as prostitutes, or rather as sex workers, which they see as a job like any other, deserving as much respect as someone who earns their money by any other means, with sex workers using their bodily autonomy to independently procure a living in the harsh world of Victorian London. As victims, they are as innocent as a member of the local church choir or temperance society. On the other hand, for anti-prostitution feminists such as Hayley Rubenhold, if the victims are prostitutes, then that would implicitly mean that they were lower and deserving of less respect and sympathy for their plight. Hence, evidence must be found to clean up their personal histories, and if they had in the past engaged in prostitution, then it was temporary, in extremis, and was not the circumstance when they met their end. The implication is that had they been soliciting when they were killed, rather than sleeping rough, then they would in some way have asked for it. This divides serial killer victims into the innocent and the not so innocent, a phenomenon that was starkly seen during the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry when Peter Sutcliffe started killing non-prostitutes. The police and the press at the time were accused by earlier waves of feminists of being misogynistic by regarding prostitute victims as not being entirely innocent. As a consequence, Reclaim the Night demonstrations were held across the country and led to a re-evaluation of how the police should approach this type of case. Strangely, feminists such as Hayley Rubenhold are more in line with the police and press of the late 1970s and early 1980s by effectively indulging in victim blaming. Tellingly, she also used the term prostitute rather than the more sanitised sex worker. Be that as it may, what is the actual historical evidence for the 5 victims that Hayley Rubenhold discusses? Hayley Rubenhold introduces Polly Nichols by saying, Her identity would be largely forgotten, though the world would remember with great fascination and even relish the name of her killer, Jack the Ripper. This is a somewhat misleading statement. Jack the Ripper's nickname is remembered. His true name and identity are obviously not, although some people like me have sought to correct this omission. Whereas Polly Nichols has not been forgotten and never was, nor were the other 4 victims that Hayley Rubenhold writes about. They may not have had a full-length book written about them collectively, but they feature by name and background in virtually every book on the subject, and there was a small book devoted to them by Neil Sheldon called The Victims of Jack the Ripper that Hayley Rubenhold heavily lent on for her factual background information. Of all the victims, of all the many serial killers who have stalked the globe, those of Jack the Ripper are easily the best known by name and identity, long before Hayley Rubenhold came upon the scene. This is how Hayley Rubenhold characterised the prejudicial attitude she claims was prevalent at the time. During the Ripper's reign of terror, newspapers eager to scandalise the nation with graphic details of slum life regularly asserted that Whitechapel's lodging houses were brothels in all but name, and that the majority of women who inhabited them were, with very few exceptions, all prostitutes. No source or reference is given for this key assertion. Against this, Hayley provided a few contemporary statistics, some based on a letter the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, wrote to the Home Office on the 25th of October 1888. There were 8,530 people living in common lodging houses in Whitechapel. There were about 1,200 prostitutes in Whitechapel, and many of them lived in lodging houses. Hayley deduced that if a third of the inmates were women, that meant there would be about 2,844 women. She rounded up. Of them, 1,200 were prostitutes, and so 1,644 were not. So over half were not prostitutes, 57.8% actually. Bear in mind that these are the statistics that Hayley uses to suggest that the 5 victims were not in the main prostitutes. Actually, there are problems with Hayley's calculus. For a start, the source she uses to suggest the proportion of men to women in the lodging houses was Joseph O'Neill's The Secret World of the Victorian Lodging House, which suggested that the figure for women was just under half, just under 50%. Hayley plumped for 33.33%, which is considerably under 50%. Would it not be more realistic to propose a 45% women to 55% men ratio? That would be roughly 3,838 women to 4,492 men. Also, clearly not all the 1,200 prostitutes lived in lodging houses. Of the 5 discussed in the book, presuming for a moment they were prostitutes, we know that Mary Kelly did not, and Liz Stride tended to only use lodging houses when she periodically quarrelled with her boyfriend, partner, or perhaps pimp, or even perhaps all 3, Michael Kidney. If we estimate that 4 out of 5 prostitutes lived in lodging houses, we're probably in the right ballpark. This would mean of the 1,200, only 960 were in lodging houses. Of the female lodging house population in Whitechapel, there would be roughly 960 prostitutes and 2,878 non-prostitutes. So actually, 75% of the women in lodging houses were not prostitutes, which is a lot higher than the figure Hayley came up with of 57.8%. So after boring you with all those figures on a purely statistical basis, this actually makes it less likely that lodging house dwelling victims of Jack the Ripper were prostitutes, which makes Hayley's miscalculation slightly strange, that perhaps mathematics wasn't her strong point. Some hardy soul could go through the 1891 census and actually add up the men and women registered as living in lodging houses to get the actual figures. Warren said in that 25th of October report that we have no means of ascertaining what women are prostitutes and who are not. This is a fairly unremarkable statement, the prostitutes didn't go around with a red light flashing over their heads, but it means that the police did not take it for granted that a female who lived in a lodging house and was murdered must have been a prostitute, when the police knew that the overwhelming majority were not. As if to reinforce this point, she also quoted Warren as saying in July 1887, "The police are not justified in calling any woman a common prostitute unless she so describes herself or has been convicted as such." So as a matter of policy, the police did not label women as prostitutes in a willy-nilly manner. Yet a key part of Haley's thesis is that as soon as the bodies were discovered in dark yards or streets, the police assumed that they were prostitutes and that they had been killed by a maniac who had lured them to these places for sex. This doesn't add up. Nevertheless, she then outlined her case. Jack the Ripper never had sex with his victims. This indeed seems to be true, but he presumably killed them before this took place, and having sex with his victim may not have been his intention or his desire. In the case of each murder, there were no signs of struggle, and the killings appear to have taken place in complete silence. Haley allowed herself the luxury of avoiding discussing the unpleasant details around the actual murder of each victim. She ends her narrative before the culprit comes on the scene. Hence, she doesn't mention that there's no evidence that most, if not all of the victims were strangled first. Hence the silence. The autopsies concluded that all of the women were killed while in reclining positions, because they were strangled into unconsciousness first, laid down and then attacked with a knife. In at least 3 of the cases, the victims were known to sleep on the streets, and on the nights they were killed did not have money for a lodging house. We'll look at this evidence when I take a detailed look at each victim. As far as the evidence was concerned, Haley was deliberately partial as to what she would take cognizance of. I have also refrained from using unsubstantiated information provided by witnesses at the inquest who didn't know the victims personally. I will look at the evidence that she employs and that which she doesn't use. Haley Rubenhold then went through each of the 5 victims, starting with Mary Ann or Polly Nichols. Haley discusses in some detail Polly's background and the nature of her separation from her husband, William Nichols. Alcoholism was certainly a contributory factor. Haley failed to mention a report dated the 7th of September 1888, a week after her murder, by Inspector Helson of Bethnal Green Police, who was in charge of investigating her murder. Helson said of her husband, in 1882, it having come to his knowledge that she was living the life of a prostitute, he discontinued the allowance. In consequence of this, she became chargeable to the guardians of the parish of Lambeth, by whom the husband was summoned to show cause why he should not be ordered to contribute towards her support. And on these facts being proved, the summons was dismissed. It is clear that Helson had checked these facts with the guardians of the parish of Lambeth, and it seems undeniable that in 1882 at least, Polly was living the life of a prostitute. At Scotland Yard, Chief Inspector Swanson, who had been appointed by Sir Charles Warren to act as his eyes and ears and was presumably well aware of Warren's advice from 1887 about labelling women prostitutes, wrote a report on the 19th of October 1888 relating to the murder of Mary Ann Nichols. Attached was a descriptive form which included the following information: profession or calling, prostitute. And in the Home Office index, body identified as Mary Ann Nichols, a prostitute. This information didn't come from biased newspapers nor from vague witnesses, but from Scotland Yard under Warren's direct supervision, yet Haley totally neglected to mention it. In October 1887, Polly was arrested for vagrancy at Trafalgar Square. This is introduced as evidence that Polly was used to sleeping rough. The circumstances were that several hundred people were sleeping in Trafalgar Square, and the police tried to get them places in various local workhouses, but Polly wouldn't go quietly and had to be arrested. The nature of this rough sleeping is important to consider. It was a communal site where homeless people would congregate, and it seems Polly was keen to stay there as it was a good location to get money by begging. This bears absolutely no relation to the suggestion that she bedded down alone on a quiet back street such as Bucks Row, not under a railway arch, not in an alcove or a recess, but on a pavement. Polly arrived in Whitechapel in the summer of 1888 and was befriended by Ellen Holland. In the early hours of the morning of Friday, the 31st of August 1888, she was turfed out of her preferred lodgings, Wilmot's, by the deputy lodging house keeper. Polly didn't have enough money to pay for her bed, despite having acquired a new hat and earned enough money to pay for a lodging house fee 3 times over, yet had spent the money on drink, becoming drunk in the process. At about 2:30 a.m, Polly bumped into Ellen Holland on Whitechapel Road. Ellen offered to put her up in Wilmot's for the night. Polly refused. According to Haley, this was because Polly's encounter with the deputy keeper earlier must have firmly convinced her that they would not allow her back that night. At the inquest into Polly's death, Ellen refused to be drawn when invited to suggest that Polly had been living the life of a prostitute, even when questioned as to how Polly might have been able to obtain money at that late hour in order to pay for her lodgings. The coroner asked, "I suppose you formed an opinion of what that meant?" Ellen replied,
"No."
What Haley didn't mention was that Ellen was the lodging house keeper for Wilmot's. She outranked the deputy who had earlier turfed Polly out. There's no reason why Polly might have been troubled about going back and facing the deputy with no money if she was the guest of the actual lodging house keeper.
Emily Holland, a married woman living at 18 Thrall Street, said deceased had stayed at her lodgings for about 6 weeks.
Most newspapers referred to Wilmot's as her lodgings. This report was more explicit.
Ellen Holland of Thrall Street lodging house keeper said the deceased had lodged with her for about 6 weeks.
And there was also this.
Helen Holland of Thrall Street said she kept a lodging house. The deceased lodged with her about 6 weeks.
This explains Ellen's reticence in answering the coroner's inquiry as to how Polly was going to earn her money at that late hour. Ellen was not going to admit that her lodging house was the resort of street prostitutes. But what was the significance of the new hat to Polly being able to get her DOS money, if not by prostitution? And how had she earned her DOS money 3 times over that day? This isn't addressed by Haley. When they parted, Polly told Ellen
that she would not be long before she was back.
And all the newspapers reported this similarly. For example,
she said she would soon be back.
Clearly, Polly had no intention of sleeping rough, but wanted to obtain some money and return. Furthermore, there was no reason for Polly to sleep rough that night. She could have slept with Ellen Holland in Wilmot's, the lodging house that Ellen ran. Instead, she decided to go out at a late hour and earn some money in the only way that a woman could earn at that hour, as a prostitute. And Polly had been found to have been a prostitute when her husband had been asked to pay for her upkeep after they'd separated. Lastly, there were reports, again unmentioned by Haley, that various inmates of lodging houses familiar with Polly had identified her as an unfortunate. Women from that place were fetched and they identified the deceased as a woman known as Polly, who had shared a room with 3 other women in the place on the usual terms of such houses, nightly payment of 4p each woman having a separate bed. It was gathered that the deceased had led the life of an unfortunate while lodging in the house, which was only about 3 weeks past. This is how Haley imagined Polly's last rest. The barest flickers of light from a window or a distant lamp would have guided her down Bucks Row. She passed beyond a set of flat-fronted brick labourers' cottages which offered no convenient nooks or porches, until the curb dipped and the wall became a gate, set back slightly from the footpath. simply slid down with her back against it to rest. Her heavy head would have slumped and her eyes eventually shut. There are several problems with this fictionalised account. Firstly, Polly walked from west to east, yet this has her retracing her steps down Bucks Row from east to west. Secondly, the recessed gateway to Brown's stables yard, outside which she was found dead, was recessed by a few inches. It was not a nook or a porch. She was found on a plain section of pavement. A more unlikely spot to bed down for the night could scarcely be imagined. Thirdly, she was not found against the gate, not curled up as if she had been sleeping. She was found lying straight down on the pavement. Fourthly, it had been raining that night. Would Polly have bedded down in the open? Fifthly, the doorway to Brown's stable yard was on P.C. Neal's beat. He had passed by at about 3:15 a.m. and Polly wasn't there. His beat sergeant, Kirby, had also passed about that time and didn't see her asleep. If Polly had been killed while sleeping on the pavement, then what does this tell us about the murderer? He must have come across her totally by chance and acted immediately on impulse. The killer must have been a murderous psychopath and must have gone out at night equipped to kill. From his perspective, it would have been an incredibly lucky occurrence to be presented with such a defenceless, unaware victim in such a location. By no stretch of the imagination would a killer have grounds for expecting to find such a victim in such circumstances. Or is it more likely that the killer, when in the mood, when the urge overtook him, went looking for a potential victim in areas where one might be found? Prostitutes are the most frequent victims of serial killers, usually not because the culprit has a particular down on prostitutes, but because, due to their line of work, they take little persuading to go off alone with males to quiet locations. A location that is quiet and discreet enough to engage in sex is invariably also quiet and discreet enough for a psychopath to kill his victim. In my opinion, the most likely scenario is that the killer found Polly soliciting on Whitechapel Road with her new hat, trying to earn some more money. Whitechapel Road was comparatively busy even at that time in the morning, and was the direction of her travel when she was last seen by Ellen Holland. There she will have met her last customer, and she then led him around the corner into a quiet and dark back street where she was murdered. The evidence that Polly was engaging in prostitution when she met her end is overwhelming. Haley neglected to consider all the evidence in making her judgment. That Polly was engaging in prostitution doesn't make her death any less tragic and doesn't mean that she is deserving in any less sympathy. This was certainly not the case at the time. Her death caused a huge sensation and the police took the investigation very seriously. This didn't prevent them from failing to catch the culprit and indeed from making several huge errors. But that is sadly the case with lots of serial killer cases that involve prostitutes and non-prostitutes alike. The next victim was Annie Chapman. Like Polly, Annie had split up with her husband and alcohol seemed to have played a major part in this. She then had several relationships with various other men, the last of whom was called Edward Stanley. Stanley seems to have stayed with Annie only over the weekends at Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street. Hardly the most romantic of assignations, but at least he paid for her alcohol and lodgings for 3 days a week. And that seems to have been the basis of their relationship. On the days that Stanley didn't pay for her lodgings, it's quite possible that Annie slept rough if she hadn't raised enough money by selling trinkets or by whatever other means. Like Polly, on the night of her murder, Annie was turfed out of her lodging house as she didn't have the money for the bed for the night. Like Polly, Annie told the deputy, Timothy Donovan,
"Keep my bed for me. I shan't be long."
It was 1:45 a.m. By what means would Annie get her DOS money at that hour in the morning? Would she think she might be able to borrow it from a friend? who would be in bed by then if they had their own money. For information on Annie's life in the East End, Hayley relied to a large extent on the testimony of one of her friends, Amelia Palmer. Unfortunately, Amelia's account varied depending on who she was speaking to and probably on the sensibilities of the journalist. At the inquest into Annie's death, Amelia is variously reported as testifying,
"For the past 5 years, she had been living an irregular life."
Timothy Donovan was also called at the inquest and didn't mention anything about Annie being a prostitute or an unfortunate. However, on the 10th of September 1888, the Times separately quoted him as saying he knew her as an unfortunate and that she generally frequented Stratford for a living. On the day of Annie's murder, the 8th of September 1888, Inspector Chandler of H Division of the Metropolitan Police wrote the initial report on the case. He recorded that Timothy Donovan identified the body and who states he has known her about 16 months as a prostitute and for the past 4 months she has lodged at the above house. Although Hayley mentions Donovan's police interview, she's silent on this aspect of it. Inspector Frederick Aberline had been seconded from Scotland Yard to help coordinate the investigation. In his report dated the 19th of September 1888, covering the deaths of Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, he stated, "Bucks Row is a narrow thoroughfare frequented by prostitutes for immoral purposes at night, and no doubt the yard of 29 Hanbury Street had been used for similar purposes." It's fairly obvious that in Aberline's opinion, Annie was working as a prostitute when she was murdered. On the 19th of October 1888, Chief Inspector Swanson compiled a report on the case at Scotland Yard. Attached was a descriptive form that included the following information: profession or calling, prostitute. Hayley didn't mention the opinions of Chandler, Aberline or Swanson, 3 senior policemen who must have been mindful of Warren's 1887 advice about labelling women as prostitutes. In Hayley's mind, when Annie left Crossingham's, she set off down Brushfield Street towards Christchurch Spitalfields. It was more probable that Annie has reconciled herself to spending the night with only the sky for canopy. So according to Hayley, Annie left with no intention to return but to sleep rough somewhere. The yard adjacent to 29 Hanbury Street was not a place Annie stumbled upon accidentally in the early morning hours of the 8th of September, but a familiar space that she would have sought for its solitude. She would have known about the gap between the house's steps and the fence. It was an ideal spot in which to curl up with her back against the wall. By ending her narrative with Annie curling up in the yard and going to sleep, presumably at some time not that long after she had left Crossingham's at about 1:45 a.m, Hayley neatly avoids a key aspect of the case. At about 1:45 a.m, a witness called John Richardson claims he visited the house to check that the cellar door was locked on behalf of his mother, who was the landlady. The cellar door was in the yard, and Richardson claims he sat on the yard steps to cut some leather from his boot. Richardson testified that he didn't see Annie Chapman, whether she was asleep or already dead. At about 5:30 a.m, Albert Kadosh, who lived next door at number 27 Hanbury Street, made 2 trips to the outside privy on the morning Chapman was murdered. He heard a man and a woman's voices, and the woman say no very softly. He then heard something falling against the fence. He thought these sounds had come from next door. A third witness, Elizabeth Long, claimed she saw someone she identified as Annie Chapman talking to someone outside 29 Hanbury Street at about 5:30. Of course, these witnesses could have been wrong, mistaken or displaying recreated memory for a host of reasons. The examining doctor, Bagster Phillips, put Annie's time of death much earlier than this. It's a hotly disputed topic, but Hayley doesn't mention any of it at all. But let's go with Hayley's suggestion that Annie chose to sleep out in the cold yard rather than on the warmer interior stairwell, which was known as a haunt of rough sleepers. Jack the Ripper, whoever he might be in your mind's eye, must have somehow chanced across her sleeping form in that backyard. Just 8 days before, remember, he had, from his depraved point of view, luckily blundered across Polly's sleeping body on Bucks Row. He can hardly have been actively looking for someone to kill in that quiet location. On this occasion, he must have been actively searching for a rough sleeper to kill. Presumably, he had been searching out various other backyards and stairwells. And when he killed her, he must have silently pulled her body out from the curled up position she had adopted by the wall as the body was stretched out on her back. Serial killers who proposition prostitutes and then kill them when they retire to a relatively secluded spot are unfortunately and horrifically reasonably common. But I don't recall hearing of a serial killer who prowled the streets looking for a rough sleeper by checking out all the backyards on the off chance of finding one, when there were hundreds of prostitutes around in the same neighbourhood. The third victim was Liz Stride, born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden. Haley freely admits that she was a registered prostitute in Gothenburg and spent several pages in her book detailing the symptoms of the syphilis from which Liz suffered. In 1866, Liz moved to London and worked as a domestic servant. By 1869, she had met and married a man called John Stride, who was about 20 years her senior, and she was now Liz Stride. The service was conducted in the famous Church of St Giles in the Fields, near the present Tottenham Court Road tube station. But they soon moved to Poplar in East London, opening a coffee house first in Upper North Street and then at 178 Poplar High Street. Haley doesn't mention, and perhaps was unaware, that this coffee shop was midway between a brothel mentioned by Charles Booth in his famous poverty survey and the location where Rose Mylett, a later Whitechapel murder victim, was found dead. It seemed to be Mylett's favoured soliciting location. The 178 Poplar High Street coffee shop was in a red light district, and it's probably no coincidence that coffee shops were often fronts for brothels. When the coffee shop venture failed around 1873, the relationship between John and Liz Stride seems to have broken down, and Liz led an irregular life, in and out of the workhouse, being arrested for vagrancy and drunkenness, and was drawn towards the lodging house quarter of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. In 1884, John Stride died, and later that year, Liz was given a 7-day prison sentence for soliciting. While separated from the still living John Stride, Liz felt the need to cover up her past by lying to multiple people. Her husband and 9 non-existent children had died in the Princess Alice disaster of 1878, which was when about 750 people had drowned in the Thames when a pleasure steamer, the Princess Alice, was run into by a much larger coal freighter called the Bywell Castle. This is exactly the sort of cover story that prostitutes invent. On the 26th of September 1888, the famous Dr. Bernardo visited 32 Flowerdean Street, Liz's last address, on a fact-finding mission among downtrodden women. He talked to some in the kitchen and claimed Liz Stride was present. He later identified the body in the mortuary. One of the women present, as if she was speaking for all of them, said,
"We're all up to no good. No one cares what becomes of us. Perhaps some of us will be killed next."
Clearly, by up to no good, she meant that they were prostitutes and so vulnerable to being attacked by the Whitechapel murderer. The night watchman at Flowerdean Street regarded Liz as an occasional prostitute. Her usual occupation was that of a charwoman, and it was only when driven to extremities that she walked the streets. When Liz left Flowerdean Street for the last time on the 29th of September 1888, she was seen first at the Bricklayers Arms with a man, and over the next 2 hours she was seen in the company of several different men in the area around Berners Street. displaying exactly the sort of behaviour one would expect of a street walking prostitute soliciting for customers. Her body was to be found at about 1 a.m. by Louis Diemschutz when he brought his cart into Duckfield's yard just off Berner Street. When Liz left Flower and Dean Street, she had money and so had no need to sleep on the streets. Furthermore, she was a long-term resident in the East End. If she was a regular rough sleeper, she must have known the best places to bed down for the night. Why would anyone benefiting from this experience choose to sleep in Duckfield's yard? It was hardly a suitable spot for a rough sleeper to bed down for the night. The building that adjoined the yard, the International Working Men's Education Club, was hosting a boisterous musical night, and members of the club used the yard. It was also used for stabling horses. Had she been sleeping there a while longer, Louis Diemschutz would have run her over with his horse and cart. With all this evidence, even Haley was conflicted as to whether or not Liz was soliciting prior to her death and whether she was a rough sleeper or not. With each victim, Haley Rubenhold focuses primarily on the person she deemed to have known the victim best and uses that person's account as her primary source. With Polly Nichols, it was Ellen Holland. With Annie Chapman, it was Amelia Palmer. With Liz Stride, it was someone called Mary Malcolm. After Liz Stride had been murdered, as in all such cases, one of the first tasks of the police was to identify the victim. Mary Malcolm came forward and identified Liz as her sister, Elizabeth Watts. However, a short while later, the real Elizabeth Watts turned up and Mary Malcolm was shown to be a fantasist. It turned out that Mary Malcolm had only identified Liz as her sister after viewing the body 3 times, and the main reason for her identification was a mark on Liz's leg, which Mary Malcolm claimed was caused by a childhood adder bite. To add a further layer of ludicrousness to Mary Malcolm's tale, she said she'd been woken up more or less at the time of Liz Stride's murder, having dreamt that she had been kissed 3 times on the cheek. When she heard of the murder, this was enough to convince Mary Malcolm that the victim must have been her sister. Of course, Haley Rubenhold doesn't tell her readers any of this. Amongst the nonsense that Mary Malcolm spouted, she did provide some biographical details that matched those of Liz Stride. For example, that she had previously had a relationship with a policeman, which was corroborated by Liz Stride's last boyfriend, Michael Kidney. She also mentioned that Liz had previously worked in a coffee shop in Poplar and that she was known as Long Liz and that she had been arrested for drunkenness. The likely and simplest explanation was that during her regular visits to the mortuary, Mary Malcolm picked up various gossipy details and wove them into her story. But Haley invented a backstory of her own. She had Liz Stride bump into Mary Malcolm by chance in 1883, and despite her Swedish accent, Liz successfully pretended to be Mary Malcolm's sister and conned Mary Malcolm into giving her money on that basis. This supposedly went on regularly over the next 5 years, and during that time Mary Malcolm didn't meet any real members of her own family, which would have blown Liz Stride's supposed subterfuge out of the water. All the while, Mary Malcolm didn't notice that Liz Stride wasn't her sister, as she was supposedly short-sighted and also presumably half-deaf not to notice that Swedish accent. Liz Stride certainly also made money from other sources, cleaning for example, but the evidence that she was engaged in casual prostitution is overwhelming, probably whenever she periodically split up with Kidney, and this explains how she met her fate. She was vulnerable to a psychopathic serial killer intent on satisfying his own despicable urges. The alternative is that Jack the Ripper searched out the backyards in that area looking for an easy victim, and for the 3rd time in succession he found a rough sleeper in an unusual location. Thank you for watching so far. Please like, subscribe, comment below. There's loads more to come in this video, so keep watching. The second victim in the early hours of the morning of the 30th of September 1888, the double event, was Catherine Eddowes. To artificially elevate Catherine Eddowes, Hayley invented a story that she and a man she lived with as if they were married, called Thomas Conway, were successful ballad writers in her native Black Country, an industrial district to the west of Birmingham that included her hometown of Wolverhampton. Hayley specifically claimed that she sold ballads at the public execution of her cousin, Christopher Robinson, in 1866. Not only did she sell ballads in printed form, but she also sung them on street corners. While Kate would have watched nooses tighten around the necks of many villains, to have witnessed the execution of a blood relative would surely have proven a different experience. Neither will it be known if they recognised her, the impersonant chanteur bellowing her verses into the chilled air. I say she invented the story, but actually she borrowed and enhanced an earlier invention from 1995 in an article in a publication called The Black Country Bugle. This story in turn was picked up by various ripperologists who, in the long tradition of ripperology, embellished it until the myth became fact. A ripperological fact, of course, isn't a fact at all. A version of the story also appeared in Neil Sheldon's The Victims of Jack the Ripper, which it is fashionable to regard as being the last word on Ripper victim scholarship. The moral? Never trust secondary sources, but to be fair to Hayley, she is no more guilty than many others in this instance. The actual original source was a story in 1888 that mentioned that Catherine had sold pamphlets with Conway, but nothing about ballads, nothing about singing, nothing about attending her cousin's hanging. That's all a complete invention. The actual story, said she, became associated with an old pensioner of the name of Thomas Conway and left Wolverhampton with him. They went first to Birmingham and subsequently travelled through many towns, gaining a livelihood by the sale of cheap books of lives written by the old pensioner. So the only truth in the matter is that Catherine Eddowes and Thomas Conway sold booklets. For Hayley, these slim pickings were the genesis for an entire chapter. The Ballad of Kate and Tom. By 1868, the couple were living in London and had a number of children, but Catherine Eddowes became over fond of alcohol and she was in and out of the workhouse and the relationship turned violent. The couple split up in 1881, but only after she had tattooed Thomas Conway's initials on her arm. Most of Catherine's family disowned her for her disorderly behaviour and the children stayed with Thomas Conway. Catherine gravitated to Whitechapel and Flower and Dean Street. There she took up with James Kelly and lived in various lodging houses. When she didn't have money for a room, she was cited as being one of 10 to 20 houseless creatures who were without the means of paying for their beds, who are regularly to be found curled up in a shed off Dorset Street. This was actually the warehouse at number 26, now closed by large doors, was until a few weeks ago the nightly resort of poor homeless creatures who went there for shelter. One of these women was Catherine Eddowes. Note that she knew a suitable indoor location to sleep rough. In September, Catherine Eddowes and James Kelly had habitually gone down to Kent to help with the hop picking harvest. Hops were grown to help in the beer making process. For working class Londoners, it was a form of paid holiday. However, 1888 was a wet year and a bad harvest. There was not enough work to provide money, so by the end of September they came back. They are known to have been staying in the village of Hunton. I've researched a fair amount of detail concerning their hop picking excursion and will probably do a film about it sometime. For now, I'll give an outline. After leaving Hunton, instead of going straight back to London, they diverted to Maidstone. Kelly stated, "We came along in company with another man and woman who had worked in the same fields, but who parted with us to go to Chatham when we turned off towards Maidstone. There they somehow had enough cash to buy some boots for Kelly and a jacket for Eddowes." This report in the Kent and Sussex Courier of the 12th of October 1888 proved that they bought these items on their way home. Many of our readers will be startled to hear that the murdered woman Eddowes was in Maidstone not more than 3 days before her foul death, that she there purchased the jacket which she wore at the time of her death, and that her paramour, Kelly, bought a pair of boots, the pawn ticket of which was found in her box. They seem to have left Hunton on Monday the 24th of September and arrived back in London on the evening of Thursday the 27th of September. Interestingly, Haley mistakenly believed that they bought these goods in Maidstone on the outward leg of their journey rather than the return leg. As a county town, Maidstone offered Kate and John an opportunity to acquire some necessities for the work ahead. Kelly was in need of a pair of boots along with a jacket. They then headed towards Hunton. Again, I'll not blame her entirely for this error. She could well be just repeating earlier ripological mistakes, as I've seen the same incorrect claim made elsewhere. As I said, if you have the temerity to publish, check your facts with the original sources. I might sound like a ridiculous pedant. After all, what does it matter? Well, in this case, I think it does matter. They had to return to London early with their tails between their legs due to their inability to earn money hot-picking that season. 2 things. Why not walk straight back to London? Why go on a diversion adding extra miles via Maidstone? And where did they get the money to buy the boots and the jacket? Maidstone was a busy market town. The shops they visited were right by the market square. I'm afraid that my suspicious mind tells me that they sold the only thing that they had of any value to obtain these purchases, and that was Catherine Eddowes. By Haley incorrectly placing the purchase before they'd even arrived at Hunton, their visit to Maidstone was part of an invented wandering looking for work, and the purchase was explained by them having hawked and picked other crops on their outward leg. This is also an invention. Back in London, they pawned the boots that had been so recently bought. By Saturday the 29th of September, the pair were totally penniless again, and Catherine Eddowes told Kelly that she would go and try and borrow some money from her daughter, who lived over the river in Bermondsey. They parted at 2 p.m. on Houndsditch on the eastern fringe of the City of London, and at about 8:30 p.m. that night, Eddowes was arrested for being totally drunk, to the extent that she couldn't even stand up, on Aldgate High Street, which is just around the corner. Clearly, she hadn't got very far towards Bermondsey, if that was ever her intention, and indeed, if she ever even actually told Kelly that. Where she'd obtained the money to get so outrageously drunk is open to question. Eddowes was taken to Bishopsgate Police Station to sober up. She was released without charge at 1 a.m. Instead of turning right out of the station to go towards her usual lodgings with Kelly at Flower and Dean Street, or to go to her usual rough sleeping spot at Dorset Street, Catherine Eddowes was seen to turn left. Haley doesn't mention the alleged sighting of Catherine Eddowes at about 1:35 a.m. on the corner of Duke Street and Church Passage, which leads to Mitre Square. 3 Jewish men saw a couple at that location, and one, Joseph Lawende, identified the woman as being Catherine Eddowes. It wasn't the most positive witness identification in criminal history, yet the police used Lawende on 2 subsequent occasions in an attempt to identify a possible murderer as Jack the Ripper. So I would suggest this sighting is at least worth mentioning, but Haley didn't. On leaving Bishopsgate Police Station, Haley has Kate bedding down in the open. She found a spot in the far corner of Mitre Square, away from the lamps dropping pools of light. Here she lowered herself down, her back against the wall as if it were a chair supporting her. Kate closed her eyes against the night and reached for whatever respite she could find. Her body was found 45 minutes later, horribly mutilated in Mitre Square, close to Aldgate High Street, where she had spent that afternoon and evening, and which was known as a haunt of street-walking prostitutes. For Haley's theorising to work, her murderer, after fortuitously finding Liz Stride in Duckfield's yard, must have now gone in search of another slumbering victim, this time on the fringe of the city. This was the evening of the notorious double event. Ignoring the street-walking hotspot of round Aldgate, he instead explored the gloomy courts and squares in the vicinity in search of an unsuspecting rough sleeper. In the very darkest corner of Mitre Square, he somehow saw and found Catherine Eddowes. Presumably, she had moved in her sleep and was no longer propped against the wall. This is not a very likely scenario, I would suggest. How was Catherine Eddowes regarded by the press? Initially, at least, they were unsure whether Catherine was a prostitute. For example, in the Daily News, it was reported, the victims were of two night wanderers. One of them is known to have been of a certain class. Clearly Liz Stride was the one of a certain class, although the same edition separately said both of the victims were women of low life. The police were more certain. She had lived with a man named Thomas Conway, a pensioner, for about 20 years and had 3 children by him, 2 sons and a daughter, but Conway was eventually compelled to leave her on account of her drunken and immoral habits. Under cross-examination from the coroner at the inquest into Catherine Eddowes' death, her boyfriend John Kelly was adamant she didn't walk the streets for immoral purposes. The deputy at the lodging house they usually stayed at on Flower and Dean Street, Frederick Wilkinson, who had known the couple for 7 years, said the same. Was Jack the Ripper surely the luckiest, from his perspective, serial killer in the annals of criminal history? Or did he go to the Aldgate area after being disturbed and thwarted at Berner Street, looking for a victim among the street-walking prostitutes known to congregate in that quarter? Finally, we come to the last of the 5, and I would say the most well-known victim of any serial killer, Mary Jane Kelly. After speculating wildly about Mary Kelly's earlier life, and to be fair to Hayley, she's not the first to do this, Mary Kelly remains after all an enigma, unknown and still untraceable, Hayley brings Mary to the Ratcliffe Highway, adjacent to London's Docklands. Hayley makes no attempt to deny that Mary Kelly had by this time been living the life of a prostitute. In Docklands, 79 Pennington Street, on the corner with Breezer's Hill to be precise, Hayley agrees that Mary Kelly was living in what in effect was a brothel. Hayley's tone towards the residents of 79 Pennington Street has none of the perky romance and sympathy we see in the other chapters of the book. They were soul-dead, disillusioned boarders. Hayley details Mary Kelly's failed relationship with Joseph Fleming and how she took up with Joseph Barnett, how that relationship broke down when he lost his job and she struggled to pay the rent for their small apartment at Miller's Court, just off Dorset Street in Spitalfields, and how this forced Mary Kelly back onto the streets. Hayley accepts that Mary Kelly had been forced back into prostitution. She admits that on Mary Kelly's death certificate, her profession is listed as prostitute, but her murder is strangely of a piece with the previous 4 victims. At some point in the very early hours of the 9th of November, Mary Jane decided to bring an end to the day and to retire to sleep. She removed her clothes piece by piece. She folded each article neatly and placed them on her chair. The flame of her only candle, which she had balanced on a broken wine glass, gutted and bobbed until snuffed. Enveloped in darkness, she slid under a bedsheet and pulled it snugly around her, protecting herself from the night. The implication is that after Mary Kelly had dispensed with the various men she had been forced to transact with over that evening, she went to bed alone and was murdered in her sleep. Hayley had mentioned that the window to her room was broken and that it was possible to open the door by reaching through. This indeed is the only suggested crime scene implication in the whole book. The authorities were of no doubt as to Mary Kelly's occupation. A Home Office report on the day of her murder said, "It is believed that the murdered woman is a prostitute named Kelly." But this had no influence on the reaction of the highest ranks of the establishment of the British Empire towards this crime. The day after the murder, Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, wrote to the Queen Empress Victoria. At Cabinet today, it was resolved to issue a proclamation offering a free pardon to anyone who should give evidence as to the recent murder except the actual perpetrator of the crime. Sir Charles Warren was simultaneously advised of the details of the offer of Her Majesty's gracious pardon. So what are we left to think? Haley accepts that Mary Kelly had worked as a prostitute for the majority of her adult life, that she had been working as a prostitute on the evening of her death. But because the previous 4 had been killed in their sleep, outside, under the stars as rough sleepers, to fit that pattern, the killer must have killed Mary Kelly in her sleep. He must have stumbled upon the others, perhaps searching out backyards and all sorts of other unlikely venues, in what must have usually have been a forlorn search for a victim. In the case of Mary Kelly, he had presumably transformed into a stalker, or did he check out Miller's Court, find out no one was sleeping in the open, noticed the broken window and chanced his arm? It doesn't make much sense to me. Is it not more likely that Mary Kelly unwittingly took the culprit back to her place, just as the other victims must have taken their killer to the site of their own murders? The evidence that all 5 of the victims were murdered while acting as prostitutes or sex workers, if you prefer, is overwhelming. Suggesting otherwise is sugarcoating the grim reality of life at the bottom end of society in Victorian Britain. They all certainly did other things to earn money as well. All of their meagre incomes did not come from prostitution. On occasion, they may have slept rough, but that was not how they met their ends. They all led a life around alcohol to dull their senses to the brutality of their existence. While living, they were at best ignored or regarded with little more than disdain. Ironically, in death, they were elevated. Queen Victoria made inquiries. Their case dominated the activities of the Metropolitan Police and the Home Office. Their funerals were the occasion of large-scale public mourning. The press collectively wrung their hands. The reason why the name Jack the Ripper is known throughout the world isn't because he's glorified, but because he's the ultimate devil in human form, who took these lives and who were by implication innocent and venerated then as now. People might speculate as to Jack the Ripper's identity, I do, but the victims have been known about and their names and graves remembered. Criminologically, suggesting that the killer came across each of these victims by total chance makes no sense whatsoever. Whoever you think the culprit might have been, or even if to you he's an unnamed phantom, he must have been looking to find a victim on those nights and early mornings. How difficult would it have been to find a lone female rough sleeper in a secluded yet uncovered spot? Most female rough sleepers tended to sleep communally in a group, and most rough sleepers chose locations under some sort of cover. A railway arch, such as at Pinchin Street, or a stairwell. When there was a ready supply of street walking prostitutes, upwards of 1,200 of them, according to Warren, in this area, why trust to the most unlikely of chances? Once, twice on one night, to blunder across a lone rough sleeper, totally fast asleep and oblivious to their surroundings. Haley Rubenhold's book certainly ignited a huge debate, which is always of great value, and brought many people to the case. But it's completely unrealistic and deliberately ignores most of the evidence about these women and hides it from her readers to facilitate her making a political point. She bends history when she's speaking to an early 21st century society audience. This, of course, has often been done before. The first detailed history of Britain, De Exidio et Conquestu Britanniae, the ruin and conquest of Britain, written in about 540 AD, 1,500 years ago by Gildas, a Christian monk, upset about the arrival of the Saxons, was written for a contemporary political purpose and is full of inaccuracies. Hayley is part of a long tradition. There's also a very long tradition in the world of Jack the Ripper for inaccurate sensationalism, for making a buck, for feeding the masses with whatever they want to hear, to cater for the ever-shifting mood of public opinion in each era. Hayley perfectly captured the zeitgeist for the post-Me Too world, hence her success. The Five is typical of the usual populist fare that is fed to the public. Back in the day, it was the Mad Jew, and then the Royals, and then a Masonic conspiracy. These things go in and out of fashion. Meanwhile, here at the House of Lechmere, we approach these murders as the work of a serial killer, and we reinvestigate it using criminological tools. We chug along regardless at our own pace, oblivious to the latest fad in our search for the timeless truth. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like and share and comment below. What do you think?